The first sign that something was different came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I just finished my third cup of coffee and was preparing to leave for work when I heard a strange sound coming from next door. It was a low, rhythmic hum, like a distant mechanical engine, but there was something almost organic about it. Oddly enough, it wasn't the first time I'd heard it. The sounds had started a few days ago, soft at first, but now it seemed to be growing louder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something unusual was going on with my neighbor. You see, my neighbor isn't exactly human. Well, not in the traditional sense. He moved in about 2 years ago, and while his species, which I can't pronounce properly, so I just call them the Celestians, looked humanoid enough from a distance, up close, there were subtle differences. His skin, for instance, had an iridescent sheen that shifted colors depending on the angle of the light, and his eyes were larger, almost too large, with a liquid silver hue that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. We got along well enough. He kept to himself for the most part, but we'd exchange pleasantries whenever we bumped into each other outside, and he'd even invited me over for tea a few times. His name, well, I'll just call him R, was a bit of a mystery. He didn't talk much about his home planet, but I gathered enough to know that he was here as part of some kind of intergalactic exchange program. That morning, as I stood at the kitchen window listening to the hum grow louder, I decided to check on him. It wasn't like R to make much noise, and something told me this was out of the ordinary. I grabbed my coat and walked over to his house. The closer I got, the more I could feel a strange energy in the air. It was almost electric, like the atmosphere before a storm. I knocked on his door, and after a few moments, it slid open with a soft hiss. There he was, standing in the middle of his living room, looking different. His normally smooth, metallic skin had taken on a deeper, darker hue, almost as if it was absorbing the light around him, and his eyes were glowing more intensely than I'd ever seen before. "Hey, R," I began, trying to keep my voice casual. "Everything okay?" R turned to face me, and for a moment, I thought he didn't recognize me. His gaze was distant, unfocused, like he was seeing something far beyond the walls of his home. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "It is the season," he said, his voice lower and more resonant than usual. I blinked, not sure what he meant. "The season? You mean, like, mating season?" R nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he was trying to concentrate on my words. "It has begun." Suddenly, it clicked. I'd heard about this before. Celestians went through a mating season once every few years, and during that time, their bodies underwent all kinds of changes. Their senses became heightened, their emotions more intense, and, from what I'd read, they experienced powerful instincts that were hard to control. "Oh," I said, trying to sound nonchalant even though my heart was racing. "Is there, anything you need? Should I don't know, leave you alone for a bit?" R's expression softened, and he took a step closer, his gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that made my skin tingle. "It is complicated. There are rituals, processes, but you are important." I swallowed hard, not sure how to respond. "Important? Me?" He nodded again, and I could see the tension in his body as he fought to maintain control. "In our culture, we require a companion during this time, not for mating, but for balance. A focus, I echoed, my brain struggling to keep up. R stepped even closer, and I could feel the strange energy radiating from him, wrapping around me like a warm breeze. "Your presence helps. It calms the instincts." I wasn't sure what to make of this. I mean, I'd heard of stranger customs between humans and aliens, but I never expected to be involved in something like this. My neighbor was asking for my help to get through his mating season, and I wasn't exactly sure what that entailed. "Okay," I said slowly. "So, what do I need to do?" R hesitated for a moment before responding. "Stay close. Be present. The season lasts for several days, and I will need your companionship." Companionship? I wasn't sure if I was ready for that, but the look in his eyes told me that this was serious, and more than anything, I didn't want to let him down. All right, I agreed, though a part of me was still uncertain. I'll help. R's face softened into what I could only assume was a look of gratitude. Thank you. Your presence is comforting. As the days went on, I realized just how intense Celestian mating season truly was. The hum that had started in the background seemed to be coming from R himself, a vibration that echoed through the walls of his home and into my bones. His mood shifted rapidly. One moment he was calm and focused, the next he seemed agitated and restless, pacing around the room like a caged animal. I tried my best to be the calm presence he needed, sitting with him in silence, offering small conversations when he seemed receptive. It was strange, though. Being around him during this time felt almost like being caught in a gravitational pull. His energy was magnetic, drawing me closer even when I didn't fully understand why. One night, as we sat in his dimly lit living room, the hum around us reaching a fever pitch, R turned to me with an expression I hadn't seen before, one of vulnerability. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "This is difficult for you." I shook my head. "It's okay, R. I want to help." He stared at me for a long moment, then spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "There is more to this. I have not told you everything." R's words hung in the air like a thick fog, and I found myself leaning forward, trying to grasp their full weight. There was more to this. I wasn't sure what he could mean. I'd already agreed to be a companion of sorts through this bizarre mating season ritual. Was there something I hadn't anticipated? "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice soft but steady. "What haven't you told me?" R stood up from the couch, his tall frame casting a long shadow against the wall. He walked toward the large window that overlooked the quiet suburban street, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. I could see the tension in his muscles, the way his shoulders tightened and his iridescent skin shimmered in the dim light. He was struggling with something. "In my species," he began slowly, "mating is not just a biological drive. It is an exchange, a connection that goes beyond the physical. During this season, we open ourselves to a bond that can transcend the barriers between minds." I blinked, trying to wrap my head around what he was saying. "You mean like telepathy?" R turned to face me, his silver eyes glowing softly in the dark. "In a way, it is more than sharing thoughts. It is an emotional and mental merging, a linking of two beings at their core. It is intense." I felt a shiver run down my spine. "So, you're saying that this bond, this connection, could happen between us?" R nodded slowly. "Yes, you are human, so it may not work as it would between two of my kind. But there is a chance that, if we continue this companionship, there could be a merging of our energies. A bond." I swallowed, my mind racing. This was far beyond anything I'd expected. I'd thought I was just helping him get through a few strange days, maybe offering some emotional support. But now it seemed like there was something deeper at play, something I hadn't anticipated. "And what happens if we bond?" I asked, my voice quieter now. R's gaze softened, and he walked back over to where I was sitting. He didn't sit down this time, just stood in front of me, his presence towering but not threatening. It would mean we would be connected. For a time, perhaps even permanently. You would feel what I feel. You would experience my thoughts, my emotions, and I would experience yours. I wasn't sure how to respond to that. The idea of being so intimately connected to someone, especially someone not even from my own species, was overwhelming. But at the same time, there was something strangely comforting about it. Despite the odd circumstances, I trusted R. Over the past 2 years, we'd built a quiet but steady friendship, and I'd always felt safe around him. Still, this was a huge leap into the unknown. What happens if I don't want to bond? I asked carefully. Is it something we can avoid? R hesitated, his eyes searching mine. If you wish to avoid it, I can leave. I will isolate myself until the season passes. But he paused, as if weighing his words. I would prefer not to. Your presence anchors me. I felt a strange warmth spread through my chest at his words. He wasn't forcing anything on me, wasn't pressuring me. He was just being honest about what he needed, and in some strange way, I found myself wanting to help him. But the idea of this bond, it was still so foreign, so overwhelming. What do I need to do if we bond? I asked, my heart racing. Art knelt down in front of me, his silver eyes locking onto mine. You need only be willing. The connection happens naturally. It will not hurt, but it will be intense. I will feel what you feel. You will feel what I feel. But we will not lose ourselves. We will still be separate. I nodded slowly, trying to process everything. There was something almost hypnotic about the way he spoke, the calm certainty in his voice. I could sense the trust he had in me, and for reasons I couldn't fully explain, I trusted him too. All right, I said quietly. I'll do it. I'll help you. R's face softened into a look of gratitude, so pure that it took my breath away. He stood up slowly, offering me his hand. I hesitated for only a moment before taking it. His skin was warm, almost too warm, and the moment our hands touched, I felt a strange pulse of energy ripple through me. The hum that had been growing in the background seemed to swell, filling the room with a soft, vibrating rhythm. R led me to the center of the room, where we stood facing each other. He didn't say anything, just closed his eyes and took a deep breath. I followed his lead, closing my eyes and focusing on the connection between our hands. At first, nothing happened. There was just the quiet sound of our breathing, the hum of energy in the air. But then, slowly, I began to feel it. A warmth spreading from where our hands touched, traveling up my arm and into my chest. It wasn't unpleasant, just different. Like standing in the sun after a long, cold day. I could feel R's presence, not just physically, but emotionally. His calm, steady demeanor was still there, but beneath it, I sensed something deeper, something restless, yearning. It was as if a part of him had been caged for so long, and now it was finally free, reaching out for something, for someone. And then, all at once, the bond snapped into place. I gasped as a flood of emotions washed over me. Fear, excitement, desire, loneliness. They weren't my emotions, but ours. I could feel the weight of his isolation, the longing he'd kept buried for so long. And beneath it all, there was a deep, almost primal need for connection, for companionship. It wasn't about mating in the physical sense. It was about something deeper, something I'd never fully understood until that moment. I opened my eyes, and R was staring at me, his silver eyes glowing with an intensity I'd never seen before. I could feel his emotions swirling around me, but instead of overwhelming me, they felt right, like puzzle pieces clicking into place. Is this the bond? I whispered, my voice shaky. R nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. Yes, we are connected now. I could feel it too, the link between us humming with energy. It wasn't overpowering or invasive. It was like a soft current of electricity running between us, keeping us in sync. I could sense his thoughts on the edges of my own mind, not intrusive, but just there. And I knew he could sense mine too. For a long moment, we just stood there, breathing in unison, feeling the bond solidify between us. It was strange, but in that moment, I didn't feel scared or uncertain anymore. I felt whole. I'm not alone anymore, R said softly, and I realized he wasn't just talking about himself. Neither of us were. The next few days were a whirlwind. The bond between R and me, though still new, felt like a tether, an invisible thread that tied us together even when we weren't physically near each other. At first, it was subtle. I'd feel a flicker of his emotions when he was in the next room. Anxiety, calm, or sometimes an odd, electric excitement. But as the days passed, it grew stronger, more tangible, until I found myself almost instinctively sensing R's every shift in mood. We didn't talk much about the bond. R seemed hesitant to push me too far, too fast, and I appreciated that. But the bond was there, humming quietly between us, growing more pronounced with each passing hour. And with it, The hum that had been surrounding us seemed to grow as well, like a persistent vibration in the air, a presence that I was slowly learning to live with. It wasn't until the fourth day that things took a darker turn. I woke up that morning with an odd sense of foreboding, a weight in my chest that I couldn't shake. The bond had been quiet, almost too quiet, and I hadn't seen her since the night before. Normally, he was around, and though we weren't constantly interacting, I could feel his presence through the bond. Today, though, there was something missing, like a low hum that had suddenly gone silent. I dressed quickly and headed next door. R's house was eerily quiet, the hum that had once been a constant backdrop now completely gone. I knocked, but there was no response. My heart raced as I tried the door. Finding it unlocked, I stepped inside cautiously, calling out his name. R. Nothing. The house felt empty, but I knew better. There was no way he'd left. Not without telling me. Not with the bond we had. I made my way to the living room, where we'd spent most of our time together, but it was deserted. The air felt heavy, thick with an energy I couldn't quite place. It wasn't until I reached the hallway that I heard something, a faint, muffled sound, like a low growl mixed with a whimper. My heart leapt into my throat as I followed the sound to R's bedroom door. I hesitated for only a second before pushing the door open. R was there, but he was different, wild, almost feral. His normally smooth, iridescent skin was darker than I'd ever seen it, the colors shifting violently like storm clouds caught in a lightning storm. He was crouched on the floor, his hands gripping the sides of his head, his body trembling with an intensity that shook the entire room. R! I shouted, rushing toward him. He didn't respond at first, just kept rocking back and forth, his eyes squeezed shut. The hum I'd felt all around him in the past days was now a sharp, painful thrum, like an electric current buzzing in my ears. R, what's happening? I asked, kneeling beside him. His eyes snapped open then, glowing so brightly that I had to resist the urge to look away. There was something unrecognizable in his gaze, something dangerous. The bond, he rasped, his voice strained and hoarse. It's too strong. It's taking over. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. What do you mean, taking over? R groaned, his body shuddering violently as he tried to stand, but collapsed back onto his knees. Our connection, it is growing beyond what I can control. I warned you, it would be intense. But now, it's merging our minds faster than I anticipated. I reached out to him instinctively, placing my hand on his arm. The moment I made contact, I felt it. The raw surge of energy pulsing through him, an unrelenting wave of emotions crashing into me. It wasn't like before, when our bond had been a quiet hum in the background. Now, it was like a storm raging inside both of us, a tempest of emotions and thoughts that threatened to overwhelm me. I gasped as R's fear and panic flooded through me, mixing with my own. I could feel his desperation, his struggle to contain the bond, and it terrified me. What do we do? I asked, my voice shaking. R's eyes met mine, and I saw the fear in them. You must break the bond. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Break the bond? The thought hadn't even crossed my mind. I'd grown used to the connection between us, even if it had only been a few days. It was strange, but I'd started to rely on him. And now, he was telling me I had to sever it. But how? And what happens to you if we break it? I asked, my throat tight with emotion. R's expression was pained, as if he was fighting an internal battle. I don't know if I can survive it, but if we don't, I may lose myself. The bond is consuming me. His words sent a jolt of fear through me, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. I didn't want to lose R. Not like this. But the bond, it was too powerful, more than either of us had anticipated. If we didn't stop it, it could destroy him. Maybe even both of us. There has to be another way, I insisted, refusing to accept that this was our only option. What if we find a way to control it? Maybe we can... R shook his head, cutting me off. The bond is beyond control now. It was never meant to be this strong between two different species. It's unstable. I could see the anguish in his eyes, the battle he was waging inside himself. And I realized in that moment how much this bond had come to mean to him, not just as a biological necessity, but as something deeper, a connection he hadn't allowed himself to hope for. And now he was asking me to sever it, to cut that lifeline for both our sakes. My heart ached at the thought, but I knew what I had to do. "Tell me how to break it," I said softly, my hand still on his arm. Or closed his eyes, taking a shuddering breath. It must be a conscious decision from both of us. We have to reject the bond, together. Focus on the separation. I nodded, though my stomach was in knots. I didn't want to lose him, but if this bond was going to tear him apart, I had no choice. We sat there in silence for a long moment, the tension between us thick with unspoken emotions. Finally, R opened his eyes, and I could see the sadness in them, the knowledge that this was the only way. "I'm ready," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I wasn't sure if I was, but I nodded anyway. We both closed our eyes, focusing on the bond, on the invisible thread that connected us. At first it resisted, like a knot too tightly wound to unravel. But slowly, as we both concentrated, I felt it loosen. The energy that had once hummed between us began to fade, like a radio being tuned out, until it was nothing more than a faint echo. The bond broke. The sudden absence of it hit me like a cold gust of wind, and I gasped, feeling the emptiness where our connection had been. R let out a soft groan and collapsed to the floor, his body trembling. For a moment, I thought I'd lost him, that the severing of the bond had been too much for him to handle. But then, slowly, he began to stir. I knelt beside him, my heart pounding. "R, are you okay?" He blinked up at me, his silver eyes dull but still glowing faintly. "I am still here." Relief flooded through me, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. He was alive. The bond was gone, but he was still here. We sat in silence for a long time, neither of us knowing what to say. The bond that had connected us so deeply was gone, and in its place, there was only a quiet, fragile calm. "What now?" I asked softly. R looked at me, and for the first time since the bond had formed, I saw him as he truly was. Not an alien, not a mysterious neighbor, but just R vulnerable. Alone, but alive. "We rebuild," he said, his voice quiet but steady. Together, the bond was broken, and though the silence that followed felt like a void, there was a strange comfort in it. I sat beside R, the weight of what we'd just done settling over us like a blanket. The connection we'd shared was gone, but in its place was something different, an understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of what we'd been through together. For the next few days, things were different, quieter between us. The constant hum of R's presence in my mind was no longer there, but I didn't feel the loss as acutely as I had feared. R was still R, and I was still me. And though our bond had been intense and overwhelming, severing it hadn't severed the connection we'd forged as friends. R spent more time in his home, recovering. His energy had been drained by the bond and the struggle to break it, and I could sense that he needed time to adjust. I visited him often, bringing food, sitting with him in silence when words felt unnecessary. There was no longer the overwhelming rush of emotions from him, but I didn't need it to understand. His tired eyes and the way he seemed to lean into my presence said enough. The mating season eventually came to an end. The strange, humming energy that had surrounded R faded, and the tense undercurrent in the air disappeared. He seemed lighter, calmer, more at peace. The storm that had raged within him had passed, and now there was a quiet stillness in its wake. One evening, as we sat together on his porch, watching the sunset cast long shadows across the street, R finally spoke about what had happened. "I've never experienced anything like that before," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The bond with a human, it was more than I could have anticipated. I nodded, understanding the weight of his words. It was intense for me too, but I don't regret it. R glanced at me, his silver eyes softening. Nor do I. You helped me through something that could have destroyed me, and for that, I will always be grateful. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the warmth of the setting sun washing over us. There was no longer the need for constant conversation or explanations. We had been through something profound together, something that had changed us both in ways we couldn't fully explain. And though the bond was gone, what remained between us was stronger. As the sky darkened and stars began to appear, I felt a sense of closure settle over me. The ordeal of the mating season was behind us, and we had come out the other side intact. Different, perhaps, but intact. So, I said, breaking the silence with a small smile, does this mean things go back to normal now? No more alien mating rituals? R chuckled softly, the sound light and warm. For the foreseeable future, yes. No more mating seasons. I grinned, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. Good. I think I've had enough alien bonding for one lifetime. R turned to me then, his expression serious but kind. You've been a true companion to me, through something most beings wouldn't understand. That is not something I take lightly. Whatever happens from here on, know that you are not just my neighbor. You are my friend. The sincerity in his voice touched me, and I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. You're my friend too, R. We sat together for a while longer, watching the stars twinkle in the night sky. The quiet between us was peaceful, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like things were exactly as they should be. The bond may have been broken, but what remained was a connection that didn't rely on telepathy or overwhelming emotions. It was a simple, steady bond of friendship, one that had been forged in the fires of something extraordinary, and that would remain long after the chaos of mating seasons and alien rituals had passed. And that, I realized, was enough.